Text completion questions are kind of like Mad Libs, except the goal is to make sentences that make sense, not nonsense. On the GRE, text completion questions can have 1, 2, or 3 blanks. For questions that have 2 or 3 blanks, there will be 3 answer choices for each blank. We're going to talk about how to tackle these types of questions using our 3-step approach. Ignore the answers, come up with your own word, and use POE. Here's an example of a 2-blank text completion question. Moby Dick, now regarded as a great work of American literature, was virtually blank when it was first published, and it was not until many years later that Melville's achievements were blank. When you're working a 2 or 3 blank text completion question, choose the blank that seems easiest to you and do that one first. If none of them seem easier to you, then choose the last blank. In this case, the first blank seems easier, so let's start with that one. We're going to go through the 3 basic steps, and step 1 is to ignore the answer choices. Now we're focusing on that first blank. Step 2 is to come up with our own word for that blank, and to do that, we're going to ask ourselves a couple questions. The first question is, who or what does that blank describe? Well, this blank is describing Moby Dick when it was first published. So we can make note of that. And now that we know that, we can ask the second question, which is, what kind of insight does this statement or sentence provide us about that thing? What kind of insight do we have about Moby Dick when it was first published? Well, we know that it's now regarded as a great work of literature. The reason that that's helpful to know is because of the transition. The transition word here is now. And now is a contrast transition. That means that there's a difference. If now it's regarded as a great work, then originally when it was first published, it must be the opposite of that. That's why the answer to your insight question is going to be the most helpful thing in coming up with your own word. So now we're going to come up with our own word, and we want something that is the opposite of being regarded as a great work. So maybe when it first came out, it was completely overlooked. Let's try that. Now that we have our own word, we can bring the answer choices back and use POE to see if any of them match the word that we came up with. So let's compare. The first option is parodied. Parodied means a humorous take on something serious. That doesn't match overlooked, so that goes away. The second is hailed. Hailed means celebrated or applauded. That's the opposite of overlooked. So we're going to get rid of that. And then the final choice is ignored. Ignored is a great match for overlooked. So in this case, that third one is our best choice. Now we're going to do the same process again for the second blank. So once again, step 1, ignore the answers. Now we can find our own word for the second blank, and we're going to ask ourselves those same questions. So the first question is, who or what does that blank describe? Well, the second blank describes Melville's achievements. Melville's achievements were blank. So that's what we're writing, something about Melville's achievements. And when we ask ourselves the second question, what kind of insight do we get into them? What we do know is that it's now regarded as a great work. But we also know that this wasn't until many years later. We have that many years later. And that tells us some more information about when something happened to Melville's achievements. Now that's our transition word or phrase. Many years later. So, if we know that it's now regarded as a great work of literature many years later from when it was published, then Melville's achievements now must be something good, something that goes along with being regarded as a great work of literature. So in that case, maybe our own word is something like, he finally was recognized. Now, when you're coming up with your own word, keep in mind that it doesn't have to be a fancy word. It can even be a phrase. What you're looking for is something that gives you the definition of the word that you're ultimately going to want to choose from the answer choices. So now that we have that recognized as our second word that we came up with for that blank, we can again go back to the answer choices and do that POE. See if we can find a good match for blank number 2. So here's our ABC, and let's match them against recognized. The first says relegated. Is relegated the same as recognized? No. And then we have celebrated. Celebrated is a great match for recognized. Yes, before it was overlooked, before it was ignored, now it's recognized, it's celebrated. And then the final choice is merited. Again, not a great match for recognized. So in this case, the best choice is that second one. So we have ignored, and then it was celebrated. 2 or 3 blank text completion questions aren't any harder than 1 blank questions as long as you follow the same basic approach. Ignore the answers, come up with your own word, and for that you ask those 2 questions. Who or what is this blank describing? And what insight does the sentence give us into that thing? And then finally, POE the answers. Now keep in mind, the GRE doesn't give partial credit for questions. So if you're going to work a text completion question, make sure you give equal attention to each of the blanks so that you can be sure to pick up those points.